Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mini Ice Age Conversations, episode number 34. Today, I have with me Sam Khoury, guest columnist writing for The Nation in Bangkok. He's put out a couple of pieces already, Myth of the Melting Sea Ice, questioning the IPCC's forecast, the air war on Earth's climate, talking about geoengineering, and also solar minimums in the fall of Western civilization, talking about how grand solar minimums do affect civilizations in the past and possibly what we could expect in the future. So Sam, thanks for joining me today. I was curious about, the reception of readers of your column, readers of your opinion piece, what kind of feedback you're getting, and just since it's an Asian publication, generally what are people talking about after they read this, and are they accepting of it? Do they believe it? Exactly how's it moving that way?
Thanks for having me on. The first one, they printed and they copied it to the internet. And then the global warming people, they came on the blog at the bottom and just went apeshit. First one I wrote, starting around 1700, right when the Maunder Minimum ended, and the Roman Empire, and the similarities are almost unbelievable, especially like the Punic Wars. I mean, like you're marrying the Roman Empire. The Punic Wars were World War II. It was the same kind of motivation. There was the same type of Hitler character. And here we go with the 400s or the 2000s, and it looks like a solar minimum, a lot of debt, a lot of corruption, higher food prices, and we could be looking at a completely different political map 100 years from now, with countries that were supposedly so stable not even there, and who knows what will exist by the time we're done with this thing.
Yeah, that's so true. And we take a look back in history and we start to see the collapse of every Chinese dynasty when we get a grand solar minimum.
I noticed that when you bring the issue up, people are really uneasy about it. And that probably means that, everyone knows it's true. It's just no one wants to confront it. You hear so many doomsday scenarios in your life that people are like, well, I don't know which one's real and which one's not really going to happen. And this one looks like it's real. And, obviously the global warming catastrophe is fake, but instead we're going to get the exact opposite, which is what happens, You get the exact opposite of what they predict.
What about Thailand weather right now? You're based down in Thailand, so I talked to somebody who golfs a lot down there, and they said that the weather is about 10 degrees cooler Fahrenheit than normally. It's not as hot on the course when they're always playing. I was wondering if you're seeing the same thing. It's a little cooler down there. I know it rained during the dry season, which is really rare. All the floods this year, in the middle of the dry season, they had massive flooding. So what's your take on the changes of the climate down in Southeast Asia?
That's absolutely true. I think this region is particularly sensitive. I remember I moved to Bangkok from another part of Thailand around 2009, 2010, and I noticed it was always cloudy every day. And that was actually what started me asking questions and wanting to learn more about the climate, because it's like, wow, this whole year's been cloudy. And so now we're getting close to a solar minimum again. After that, around 2014, it got hot and sunny, but it just responds to the sun. When you have low solar activity, it's just cloudy all the time, so it's not hot. It doesn't necessarily rain that much, but I just showed you the video right now. It's cloudy today, and it's pretty much cloudy every day. It's rare that we get sun, so it's going to be like that for the next few years. The hot season was a little bit, in March and April, but it's not as long as it used to be, because just all the clouding keeps dampening the weather. So it's actually quite nice here. I like clouds more than sun. I don't know what it's doing to the agriculture here, though. Probably nothing positive there.
Yeah, there's always going to be some repercussion. Focus in on a couple of the articles that you wrote and maybe talk about what some of the future articles you're thinking about writing, because I know you just got printed again. Can you tell us about the latest article that you published?
I've written probably 6 of them, and a lot of them are just kind of redundants. But as the extreme weather comes in, and especially what I get off your network, I then write another one just to sort of offset all this bullshit you read every day with the global warming, because they're always saying global warming, and then most of the weather is actually cold Just watching the news, you've got this really intense blizzards in the winter, and then when the summer gets here, it's mostly mild. I mean, there's a few hot days, but I think Tony Heller does the best job with his presentations of showing you just how much hotter it was in the 1930s. It was like a full 20 degrees hotter on a typical summer. You know, places that are 100 now, back in the 1930s, they were 120, and he does such a good job of showing that that's true. And despite that, we've got this completely fake chart that shows the 1930s like it was the mini ice age, as if we're living in a hot period. Now it's complete nonsense. So a lot of the articles I just wrote are the latest cold. I might remark on the latest scandal involving the temperature manipulation, and it's just kind of like every few weeks, about maybe once a month or so, I write another one. You know, it's not a huge newspaper, but it is the second English newspaper in this region, in the Bangkok. The other one won't touch this stuff because I've talked to the editor at the Bangkok Post, and I talked to him on the phone once, and he just won't touch this stuff. The number one biggest newspaper, they won't print anything that's alternative. If the Bangkok Post was the LA Times, The Nation, which is what I write in, is something more like the Orange County Register, you know. So it's still that the mainstream media won't touch the subject. They're under so much pressure by these global warming people that come out and start screaming. And that's what I noticed when I wrote my first one. It was called A Cold Sun Rising. And they had gone ahead and copied that over to Climate Depot. And when they did that, it got like 120,000 hits. That was the very first one I wrote. I think the media itself now is to indulge a little bit more the global cooling stuff, because as it becomes more obvious, then the confidence in the establishment science is so low right now. And the polls taken show that people are not believing the global warming thing anymore. I think probably by the 2020s it is going to be a dead issue. It's going to be like Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. You know, it's going to be like by then it's going to be in that category. That'll be really crazy because it's been going on so long. But you wonder if they can really continue doing it through the 2020s. After all, they rode out that whole cycle from like 2010 and then 2014 when you had those intense blizzards. They just sort of ride those things out, you know, and they just keep saying global warming. And then they say, well, the reason you had the blizzard is because the oceans are warm and that sort of thing. I don't know if they can keep doing that. I think the gig is up then. And I don't think they can keep the adjustments going either. They can adjust a little, but it's going to start to get so cold that they're going to have to admit that, oh, yeah, it is actually cooling a little bit now. I suspect they're going to wait until a volcano erupts. And one thing I did write in my articles is that if you look at Mount St. Helens and Pinatubo 11 years apart, and both at the tips of solar cycles, and I got that off listening to one of the people that you interviewed, that they happened at either solar maximums, solar minimums, and then you had some big ones around 2010, and right around 2020, that just sort of fits the pattern. You know, two big ones and then a big one around 2020 on the first solar minimum. You'll probably get a big volcano. And I think that's when they're going to say, oh, yeah, well, it is actually cooling a little bit now, but that's because of the volcano. So that's my prediction.
Yeah, and we'll go back to the manipulation. There's so much coming out in I consider it the mainstream media of science. These people you're talking about, Climate Depot, not a lot of people know that. What's up with that? All these other sites that are showing you what the true data is. And, you know, NOAA and NASA and GISS caught outright manipulating data to try to erase that mid-century cooling. Not only are they trying to erase the Dust Bowl heat, but they're also trying to erase the dip in temperature, the natural cooling, by lowering those temperatures to make it appear as if it was continually up, continually up, continually up. But they're trying to even make that 1950s cold spell erase out of the record too. And with NASA, and if I might add one last point here, with NASA, they just came out and said, hey, the solar minimum's coming. It's only going to drop 0.3 of a degree, but you bad humans are warming the globe, so your CO2 production is going to outwarm the new solar minimum coming up. So again, we got to impose a global tax on you because, you know, you're such bad humans for driving cars and stuff.
With so much money riding on it, they really will continue to do that until the end. I mean, when you get a President Trump, he doesn't really, it's too disruptive for him to go in there and sort of just clean house, at the NOAA and NASA, and just throw all these people out and say, okay, now we're going to give you the truth. It's like they've got so many, maybe even trillions of dollars riding right now on government-subsidized industry. And when you go back to the Roman Empire, that's exactly what happened to them. They started off as this very free market situation in the early, prior to BC, in the BC. And then later on, it became the system where everyone is dependent on the government for their well-being. Whereas before, like if you take America in like the 1920s and the 1910s and prior to World War II, it was very much a free market society. The military-industrial complex didn't even exist. The United States in particular was the biggest manufacturer in the world, but they were manufacturing all sorts of consumer products, and they were getting very rich doing it, to the point when you reached the 1930s, Germany was going to the United States, borrowing large amounts of money from American banks, and that was an indication of what the real superpower was at that time, that it was the United States, because they had a real economy, not something that was just dependent on the government. And Germany was just borrowing money and putting everything into their defense sector. And now you have a situation where it's the United States that borrows money, at least 20% of the debt that they keep raising the debt ceiling, and at least 20% of the debt is owed to foreigners. And that's a very fragile system, I think, when you've got higher food prices coming and a mountain of debt, a debt ceiling that keeps rising higher and higher, and it could break the system, that the international economic system in which the governments in these Western countries are the main force behind the economy. And if they go bankrupt because of a financial crisis, high food prices, then you could have something like the 400s, which I think the 400s for the Roman Empire was due to financial crisis, not so much that the Germanic people hated the Romans so much. That was part of the problem, that the Romans were dependent on people who didn't like them very much. And now it seems like that same type of thing, where climate science is one of those things where the government spends the money after they tax the people, and then you have all of these private interests that are dependent on something like the money continuing to come in from the government. And that's the same thing that happened like with the Iraq War, is they knew it was a bunch of bullshit, but you had a lot of private interests that wanted to get in there in that Iraq and make money, and that meant that the government needed to invade Iraq. That's where I think we're at right now. We've got an economy, and we've got the public in the whole world that is dependent on the international government, the UN, the United States, to lead the international government, which is behind everyone's well-being. And so that could be a real disaster when the world doesn't have a real economy. It just has these governments that pile up debt to take care of everyone's well-being. The higher food prices come in, and then it breaks the model, and you've got a depression. That could change the map of the world and cause an unspeakable amount of death, because at the same time, you've got the agricultural sector in places like Africa and the Middle East that's shot with all the wars they have there. They don't have much going on. A lot of those countries, like these Middle Eastern countries, are dependent on food exports from northern countries, from countries like Northern Europe, Russia, the United States. This is what's providing everyone's food. It's a very serious situation, and the world isn't doing anything about it because everyone is obsessed with global warming. We're just sitting here walking right into it. It's not good. We can start to try to educate people, but it may be too late, because the government was corrupt, and they saw this problem coming way back in the 70s. They refused to do anything about it. Instead, they just let scammers commit fraud. so that they could enrich themselves off government largesse. And I'll add one thing. It's normally a small group of people that make the big money off things like the Iraq War or the global warming scam. Everyone else kind of gets poor. You know how that goes.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's it. And the stake of trillions upon trillions of U.S. dollars. Now, here's my thing. They've known that this grand solar minimum is approaching, yet they keep pushing the global warming agenda. For me, it's almost as if they're telling people not to prepare. And the only people that are really preparing are the ones who are getting the message. And maybe those are the ones that they want to survive. Because when we come to these food prices, we are absolutely out of time. At the end of the year, when the harvests come in, they're going to be so far under expectation that it is going to absolutely shock the futures market. So at the end of the year during the harvest time, look for absolute spikes in food prices. And in 2008 and 9, you could shift your driving pattern. It was all about energy costs. $147 a barrel oil, gold prices up, commodities prices up, all based on energy costs. But you could shift your spending patterns to mitigate some of those higher prices that you were getting at the pump. You could carpool, you could drive less, but everybody eats every day. And this is a complete game changer. You can debase currency like they did in the Roman Empire, like we're doing now. I mean, how much is a dollar worth compared to what you were talking about in the early 1900s? Before the Federal Reserve was formed, what is our value of a dollar now? Probably like 2 cents on the dollar compared to what it was a full dollar value 100 years ago. But when we get into this higher food prices, the lowest earners are going to be affected first. If they're on government support, there's like 40 million people in the United States that are getting food support from the government. If their food prices double, they're just simply not going to have enough for the basic necessities. Now that leaves two scenarios. A, the government raises their benefits and taxes more, or we go into a social strife situation where people on the streets protesting, and this is the beginning of every repeating cycle. You're talking about the ushering in of the late antique little ice age 400, especially around 535, everything collapsed. That was the absolute end of the Roman Empire based on the late antique little ice age, massive cooling based on volcanic activity. Japan was decimated, their economy collapsed, wars, the shogun, everything was just in disarray on this planet. Chinese dynasties collapsing that time, and we're about to repeat this cycle again. So when it comes to food prices, you got to wonder how the governments of the world are going to react. Is Venezuela a test case where they're allowing it to run out as far as it can so they can see like how the human species will react to all this stimulus and shortages and people starving around them? You know, you got to wonder, and then how are the police and the army going to cooperate, like you've seen these new laws passed in Australia to allow the army and the military to cooperate for social unrest? Is that a test case also to see how the Western, more, say richer countries or more advanced economies would react when you start to see police and soldiers on the street policing supermarkets and this sort of thing when food prices go? So we've got two ends of the spectrum here. The full final throes of what would happen when a society collapses, and then also how people would accept all these new laws of police and army working together. So I see this massive, massive social upheaval coming based on food prices, not energy prices. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Well, absolutely. I think the lesson from the previous financial crisis is the one in about 2009, and the one before that, and then the one before that, was that when you have a stable supply of raw materials, and that includes food and energy, mostly food. It's always going to be food. It's going to be more important. So these crises are mostly caused by corruption, like what was going on with the debt market back then in the last one. And they can kind of ride these out. But the question is, what happens like in the 2020s, like if you get the big volcano, and then you've got these other feedbacks, as you mentioned, that create a very cold period then, and that's certainly what I believe. That's what you believe is going to happen. That's what's been predicted by real scientists, not scamming scientists, and you know it's coming. Then you've got a situation where you've got all of that corruption that you had before, and now you've got a restriction in the most important raw material, which is grain and rice and corn, and our entire economy, especially here in Bangkok. Yeah, well, they have manufacturing here, but there's a big, restaurant and hotels we're at a point in the international economy where that's a big thing. Travel, restaurant, and hotel. So many people are working in that industry, and that is completely dependent on having cheap food. Cheap food is the whole thing there. If the food isn't cheap, then all the prices go up. When demand goes down, then the prices go up even more, and that's when we could be into the next financial crisis, which could be the one that the world is not able to come out of. That could be the one that creates just a completely new global situation where you don't really have rich countries and poor countries anymore. You mentioned the Western countries. On paper, they're the most economically strong. But at the same time, they have, I don't want to go into this issue too much and be called, a racist or anything like that, or playing race politics. But I consider countries, the Western countries, their societies because they are multicultural. This is one thing I talk about in my latest article, that I consider that kind of a fragile society. And what that means is that a country like China or Russia or even this one, they lose everything all the time. It's always been sort of a struggle for them. So when they fall on rough times and they've got bad economic times, they've done it before and they'll sort of get through it. The country will still be there. There might be a lot of misery, like during the Great Leap Forward. You could have a big major chaos in these countries, but ultimately they will come out of it. Western countries, on the other hand, I'm not sure that they can sustain something like this. They're used to having it good. You could be in a situation, I think in Europe especially, where they just turn around and say, look, we have to send all of these people back home. These immigrants that have come here because we're a rich country and they're a poor country and they come here to work for us, we can't do that anymore. We're not a rich country. They all have to go home now. And who knows what kind of chaos that creates. The leaders in the world, the Western countries, they may find themselves in a position where they can't lead anymore. And then who's going to lead? No one's going to lead. Like I said, no rich countries, no poor countries. Everyone is just in a tough situation. That's what the situation I think we could find ourselves in. And you mentioned that we have seen countries like the United States preparing for civil unrest. I've heard preparing large places for detention so that they can keep the population from fighting each other, so that the population doesn't start killing each other. Like I said, not to be racist, the countries that tend to be multicultural, that people start blaming each other for the problems. So I think in the future, the world will not be able to depend on leadership from the traditional leader, which has been the Western Europe and the United States. Those countries might have their own problems to the point where they're not exporting a lot of food, and they're just trying to keep everyone else from killing each other. I think that could be a real disaster, that the West, particularly the United States, has spent so much money trying to fix the Middle East when it could have been spending that money maybe reinventing the whole agricultural system, building better infrastructure, trying to satisfy the people at home. Problems are brewing at home.
Yeah, when you talk about let's go back to the point of you're talking about at some point in the future, nobody's going to be leading. Now, for me, that seems like a decentralization. Now, if the economy collapses, if we move over to cryptocurrency, that's exactly what the monetary system would be, a decentralized monetary system. So I could see the world government really pushing cryptocurrency. And also one of my premises is that the amount of ramp up of news stories concerning global cooling and the grand solar minimum, the amount of news stories with cryptocurrency and the adoption of it and the adoption of the idea is going to go lockstep with the adoption and the ideas of a grand solar minimum cooling event. Having a decentralized currency out there alleviates the need from governments across the planet to, police their banking systems.
Well, 2030s is when the Maunder minimum begins. I mean, it might be warming then just because it got so cold, but it's still going to be a Maunder minimum. It's still going to be cloudy all the time. If it's cloudy all the time, then how much crop production can you really have? I mean, there are things about the modern world that they didn't have in the the early 1800s, when most places were just eating what they were growing. In the modern world, you can ship things all around the world and keep the food prices lower, maybe, but we don't know that. It's a big wild card. How bad? I think, like I heard you say during your radio show, that the volcanoes are the wild card, but you will start to have the bigger ones because they always come with the low solar activity, and that's been the history. The history has been high solar activity, low volcanic activity. That was 200 years since the early 1800s, and now we're shifting back to low solar activity and high volcanic activity. And I don't think anyone, especially at the UN, has considered how much is the food production going to be hit. Or maybe they have, and they decided that it's just so bad that they don't even want to approach it, and we might as well just deal with it when it comes because it's that bad. We don't know. We're waiting in the next few years to find out.
I can answer the question for you, what you just said there. Community Systems Earth model, this is a new model that's the highest tech. It's got the latest technology. It's running on supercomputers. Now, what they did was they pushed up the cosmic ray, induced clouds on the layer from 15,000 to 18,500 feet, kind of like Svensmark and CERN's research did. But what they did as the new model was they took it to the uber. First, they doubled the cloud amount, and then they went up 10 times. And then talking to Lee Wheelbarger, inventor Lee Wheelbarger, he said they pushed it up to 100 times. And what happened when they broke the models? They were so fearful of how the climate patterns changed on our Earth that they shut off the models. They wouldn't release any of the data. They won't show anybody the model runs because of what happened with the increasing cloud cover between doubling and 10 times, which we're going to get into with the cosmic rays inducing more clouds, and then also the volcanic aerosols and particulates creating another cloud layer. Once they ran the model, it was absolutely so frightening that they don't want to let the public see what happened.
Yeah, that's what I was suspecting, something like that they actually looked at this stuff way back in the 70s, even before they had the computers, and said, you know what, there's no way there's going to be enough. We might as well just walk into it because we have no solutions. We've gone too far.
And this would usher in the smart contracts on the, say, Ethereum blockchain, because as all these currencies start collapsing around the world and governments become unstable and monetary systems become unstable and the belief in the fiat currencies becomes even less and less, are you going to send a ship of 60,000 tons of wheat across the ocean if you can't 100% be guaranteed with payment? You talked about that earlier. I mean, the way we buy, sell, and trade today all revolves around letters of credit, international banks, clearing houses. We need all of this in place, and it's such a fragile system. If even one part of that snaps out, then the entire system's non-usable. So going forward, it's my personal opinion that we're going to start using smart contracts built on the blockchain, because that's 100% locked funds in there that guarantee payment for either the buyer or the seller, and all the stipulations with that going forward, because the monetary system is going to be in such flux. And they'll have the riots in the streets, and the governments will be fighting to try to just even keep their power intact. At that point, you really can't guarantee payment for delivery. And when goods, specifically grains and food products, are going to become the most valuable thing traded on our planet, there's going to have to be a different way to guarantee payment. And this is going to be it. It's going to be sort of a cash-based system. But again, I'm not going to load a container full of dollar bills and ship it over to you. We're going to have to do it in a different way. And with unstable currencies across the planet, it's going to move into cryptocurrency that's not based on any fiat currency. So it's going to be decentralized. We're going to be using smart contracts, and we're going to be using a different base monetary instrument, if you will, to do these transactions, because food is absolutely going to be affected to the point it's going to destabilize society, and the reset button will be hit. And I do thank you for spending your valuable time listening to Sam and I talk and discuss these very important issues. We're right at the cusp this year of the rollover in exactly what we're talking about. So this winter across the Northern Hemisphere should be incredibly intense. And if it is, we are absolutely at the cusp of a life-changing, societal-changing series of decades that's unfolding in front of us. Now, Sam and I are going to continue our conversation in the next episode of Mini Ice Age Conversations, where we talk about central banks trading gold and different types of medium of exchange that could be used during the grand solar minimum, as well as what you can expect with more population migration and things that are going to increase in value and different assets that are going to decrease in value as we move forward. I'll see you next time.